So good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to spend a few minutes talking about consent or pay. So just as a reminder, this is where online users are given the choice to either consent to the use of their data or the placement of tracking technologies for personalized advertising purposes, or if they don't want to do that, they have to pay a sum of money. And consent or pay has been a very controversial topic. On one view, it's about businesses having freedom to operate. It's about being able to price their services, make their content available to users, and monetize that content. And on the other view, it's about users being asked to pay to protect their fundamental data protection rights. Those are two quite extreme views, and there's been an awful lot said about it. This year, what we've seen is a greater adoption of consent or pay models. We've seen new guidance, we've seen some enforcement action, we've even seen some litigation in relation to consent or pay. So in terms of how we got here, just to set the scene, and I'll do this in fairly brief terms given the time, you may recall that Meta has been taken on a bit of a journey as to its lawful basis for personalized advertising, and Meta being somewhat of the canary in the coal mine because obviously other ad-supported platforms have had to follow suit. But essentially, Meta started life saying contractual necessity for personalized ads, ran into the EDPB, then they said, okay, we'll do legitimate interests, ran into the CJAU, so now they've ended up with consent. And so they've had to think about new models in terms of how they achieve that consent. At the same time, you've got regulatory guidance, which not only makes clear that they don't like legitimate interest or contractual necessity, and they like consent, but also stresses how difficult it is to get consent. So it has to be capable of being withdrawn, it has to be informed in a very complex ecosystem. You can't use dark patterns and deceptive design. Those of you that were here last year may have heard me talking about that then. And so you have to get consent, that's the first thing. Consent is really difficult. Then you've got the ICO, and Anna mentioned this earlier. The ICO has been writing to everyone under the sun. Started off with the top 100 websites, now moved on to the top 1,000 websites in the UK. Some of you in this room might have even been dealing with some of these letters. And what they're saying is they're focused on how these websites get consent from users. So in particular, is there parity between the options on the website? You know, when you click accept all, do you also have an option to reject all? And so the result of all this is that lots of websites and online services have had to change their consent practices, give parity of option, and the result of that is falling consent rates. So we had the chief data officer of The Independent said that when they introduced their reject all button, they saw something like a 20% drop in consent rates. Now, anecdotally, I think that's probably quite a conservative figure, actually, in terms of the drop. So that obviously has a significant impact on monetization. And the result is that the online services are having to think about different options. Meta has gone for a consent or pay model, as have a number of others. And so last year, we got the EDPB's view, and again, I'm not going to go too much into the EDPB because Mike covered it very nicely last year for us. But essentially, where the EDPB got to, they issued an opinion on consent or pay, and the outcome was they said, in most cases, it will not be possible for large online platforms to operate a consent or pay model in a compliant way. And what they said was, if you're going to do consent or pay, you need to offer not just a consent option and a pay option, but also a third option, which is a free alternative service with no targeted ads. And that left a lot of us scratching our heads because, well, how does that work? That seems to cut across the whole model. That doesn't seem to be very economically viable. So we were all sort of waiting to see what the ICO had to say, and the ICO put out some guidance this year. Now, there's a bit of nuance in terms of how the ICO's approach differs from the EDPB's. On one level, it's pretty similar, and it touches on a number of the same factors in determining whether the consent or pay model is valid. And in particular, it's focused on whether that consent that you're seeking could be freely given. And it looks at very similar factors to the EDPB in determining what freely given consent is. Where I think there's a difference is largely in tone and emphasis. So whereas the EDPB opinion is sort of saying, we don't see this as viable, and bear in mind they were just focused very much on large online platforms, the ICO's approach is, if you do it right, maybe. If you do all the right stuff, maybe. And I think that's quite an important distinction. In terms of the factors to be considered when you're considering whether consent is freely given, power imbalance is important. So is this an essential service that users can't get elsewhere? If it is, it might make it difficult for them to feel like they can freely give consent to targeted advertising. They might feel like they're being pushed into it. And that brings in various kind of competition law type considerations like market dominance and switching costs and things of that nature. How you land at the fee is really important. How do you price this? So the ICO is clearly not going to wade into what the number should be, but interestingly what they say is the fee that you charge can't be based on what you're going to lose in revenue from a targeted advertising perspective or what users might be willing to pay for the service, but rather it's the value that consumers associate with not being tracked for personalized advertising purposes. How on earth are you going to work that out? The other key issue is equivalence. So it's no good providing a consent option and a pay option if your pay option is rubbish. If your pay option is essentially no functionality, no personalization, no choice and control for users. So there has to be a broad equivalence between the service offerings. And then obviously none of this works if you've not got privacy by design embedded. So if you've got dark patterns all over the place, if it's deceptive, if you're hiding information from users, then no matter what you do or in terms of setting an appropriate fee, it's not going to be good enough. So very briefly to finish, in terms of what happens now, I'm seeing this as a kind of two-track process. So you've got what happens for the very large online platforms and you've got everybody else. For the very large online platforms, they've got a very difficult EDPB opinion. They've got a pretty difficult ICO opinion to grapple with. Meta is challenging that EDPB opinion in the courts on the basis that they didn't have an opportunity to be heard in relation to that opinion and various other procedural points. They've lost on the first instance judgment there, but that's going to run and run. At the same time, if you're a very large online platform, you've also obviously got the DMA to contend with. And again, Meta has very recently been the subject of enforcement action under the DMA, specifically in relation to its consent or pay models. So for the very large online platforms, the path forward looks challenging. For everyone else, at least in the UK, reasonable path forward, it seems to me, at least for now. We'll have to wait and see as to whether there's any enforcement from a GDPR perspective, either from the ICO or from any of the European regulators, but I would say somewhat of a path forward. I'll leave it at that.